You are our Redeemer. Amen. It is, I think, a fact of human nature that people like you and people like me would like at all times to consider ourselves to be in the majority, to be accepted by those around us, to be accepted by the culture we live in, maybe even to be popular in that culture. We want to have things in common with the culture so that we feel part of the group, so that we feel comfortable with those around us. We don't want to seem different. We don't want to look weird. We don't want to look old-fashioned. All that is true, but is it enough? Suppose you accomplish, with all of your energy, being part of the majority in every situation. Is that a good thing? God calls us, first in baptism, then throughout His Word, at His table, He calls us to be holy. And I think in this context, we need to be very specific with what that word holy means. It means to be set apart, to be different, even at the cost of being laughed at, even at the cost of being considered weird. We are called to be holy. After all, when God gave us life, and then when He claimed us, adopted us as His children, He gave us an owner's manual for the life, how to live as God's child. And that owner's manual is the 10 Commandments. And those 10 Commandments, it seems, in almost any culture you can imagine, in any place, at any time, those 10 Commandments do set us apart, set us sort of in opposition to the majority. That's the point that Paul is dwelling on in our epistle lesson today. Now here's the context. Paul is writing to the church he established in the Greek city of Corinth. It was not an easy task in that very, very pagan, very Greek, very logical, confused culture. It was not easy to establish a Christian congregation, but he did, and he was concerned for it. And so wherever he went, he took pains to write them a letter to see, I heard about this in Corinth. Here's some advice for you. Or I heard this good thing happen. Congratulations, people of Corinth. The congregation in Corinth was made up, I don't know the percentages, but both of Jews and Greeks. And it was in Greece. And so Greek culture had to be considered by every member in this congregation. And one of the things that seems to concern Paul is that they didn't understand the very idea of Christian liberty, the very idea of how to be holy, how to be set apart, because the Corinthian church just had a whole raft of problems. That's why the tone of anger and disappointment is present in Paul's words all through Corinth. Some of the problems that concerned Paul and that he wrote to them said, you got to deal with this stuff. Rivalries among groups, maybe groups seeking leadership in the church, maybe groups seeking to have the church do this task rather than that task, but rivalries between parties of Christians within the Christian church. Paul also kind of scolded the church for being a bit naive in their faith. He called them babes in the faith. He said, you're a little immature in your understanding of things. You've got to get back into the Word. You've got to understand more fully what I taught you, because obviously you didn't understand it all. You are too easily misled by the naivete of the way you approach the gift of Christ, the throne of God, the whole process of being Christians. He said, you live in Corinth, one of the most sexually wild and immoral places in the Roman Empire. and you haven't completely divorced yourself from that. He even cites an example of a man who now has taken into his house and into his bed his father's wife. I'm glad he didn't use the word mother, but it's his father's wife that now this man is living with, as if it were his own wife. And Paul says, no, this kind of stuff, which is accepted by the majority in Corinth, you can't accept that. You've got to make comment on that. You've got to stand up against that. He also said, and I have heard that between some of you Christians, you're involved in lawsuits against one another. Surely you could have sat down and talked out the problem and worked some solution, not bring it to a foreign pagan court to try to wring the last bit of satisfaction and maybe the last penny out of the person you want to sue. Don't do that. Settle it among yourselves as Christian brothers and sisters. And then the one that gets a lot of attention, Corinth was a pagan city. There were all sorts of pagan temples, and they had big feasts, and they usually had food left over. It was good food. It was properly prepared. And some Christians had said, well, gee whiz, we live in inflationary times, and there's this food from the pagan, and it's just food. Why don't we get that and eat it? And Paul says, well, it requires you to explain why you think it's okay for you to eat food that was once offered to idols. He says, if you can make the argument that it's just food, well, fine. But he said, do you understand the image you present when you eat the food that was once offered in honor of a pagan god? There were these issues and many more, and that's what much of 1 Corinthians is about. Paul kind of itemizing these problems in the Corinthian church and saying, you've got to face some of them. But Paul knew it's not just in the Corinthian church. This is the kind of problem, dealing with the majority and caving in to what the majority thinks is okay. That's always been a problem for God's people. Now, I often take issue with the way we set up our lectionary, where we start the assigned readings. Today in 1 Corinthians 10, we start in verse 6, and we say these words at the start of the epistle. Listen, now these things took place as examples for us. What things? What is the context that Paul's talking about? I don't know why they didn't start at verse 1. Let me read you 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through 5. For I want you to know, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. In other words, Paul is talking about the Exodus people. Paul is talking about the people of God that had been led out of Egypt, and now they were in the desert. And Paul says, boy, they did a lot of stuff wrong. And remember, this is in the midst of a Corinthian letter, which is telling these people, boy, you guys do a lot of stuff wrong. Israel in the wilderness, in Paul's writing, is being set side by side in comparison with Corinthian believers on the subject of idolatry. In the wilderness, Israel worshiped the golden calf. Where did that idea come from? Well, they had been in Egypt for 430 years, and they saw the way the Egyptians related to worship. And they said, oh, well, that must be okay because we've watched it for 4 centuries. Moses is up on the mountain talking to God. There's thunder and cloud and scary stuff, so God's up there. We want to worship God the way the Egyptians worshiped. And Paul says, no, that's idolatry. You had to make a golden calf so you had something to look at when you were looking and thinking about God, and you know he's right up there on top of Mount Sinai. Then he talked about worship practices. He says, do you recognize how much your Christian worship services look like pagan worship services? Do you realize the distinction that ought to exist between the way the pagans of Corinth worship their false gods and the way you worship God? And then he used this kind of really interesting idea of, are you putting Christ to the test just like the Israelites did? He said, in the miracles in the desert, where Moses was able to provide water for his people in a place where there was no water, water from a rock. He said, realize the rock was Christ. The rock was God taking care of his people, giving them undeserved, miraculous rescue in a place where they all should have died of thirst. But then they weren't grateful enough. They had a failure of gratitude. He said, is that kind of the way you react to God when he has given you the gift of Jesus? He has given you the gift of faith in Jesus. Are you properly understanding the enormity of that gift? Are you properly grateful to God that he gave you his Son to pay your sinful penalty so that you might be forgiven, so that you can be with God in heaven for eternity? And then the one that maybe troubles me the most, and maybe it should trouble you the most too, he uses the simple word grumble. He says, and God took action against those who grumbled. If you are a member of this church or any church, you've grumbled about something. And some of you are really good at it. You've grumbled a lot. And you're good at grumbling. And we all have that problem. And Paul says, don't do that. Don't do that. Work to solve a problem if you're right and there is one that exists. But don't grumble about it, because to grumble about it is to basically criticize God and criticize God's people for something that can be fixed. God is not mocked, Paul could have easily added. Then, having laid out this list of Israel failed this way, we in Corinth are failing this way, Paul says all of this stuff is remembered, it's recorded, it's written down, because it's supposed to be a lesson for you. It's supposed to open your eyes. Seeing what Israel did, seeing what we're doing, we're supposed to notice these things and begin to stop doing it and to correct what's wrong. But then he says it's especially important that you Christians see these things, react to them this way, because the end of the ages has come. Now, he doesn't mean the end of the world. He means the promise that God made all the way back in the Garden of Eden, the promise that he made to these people wandering in the wilderness, that one day the Christ would come, the promised one, the anointed one, who would come to rescue his people. He said, it's not a promise to us anymore, not here in Corinth, in the highly modern world of the first century AD. Christ has come. The promise has been kept. We've seen it. We gathered to celebrate the fact that that promise has come. We ought to be able to look at our owner's manual for life, the Ten Commandments, and apply it to those things that we do and say and think, and work hard. We ought to use that owner's manual to come closer to the goal that God sets for us, to be holy, which means to be set apart. Now, Paul points out this is serious stuff. He points out that a whole generation was lost in the wilderness. If you read all of Genesis and Exodus carefully, it's hard to come to the conclusion that of all the people that left Egypt, that were led by the cloud, that were following Moses, that passed through the Red Sea, all of those people died in the wilderness except for Joshua and Caleb. I've heard the number of people that were part of this Israeli, between 2 and 3 million. And their corpses are all over the Sinai desert, and their bones are there. He says, God is serious about this stuff. You have learned how God keeps his promises. You have the owner's manual in your possession of the commandments that he gave to you during this time. But the generation that was blessed by God directly in the wilderness suffered God's punishment. And they're never going to leave that wilderness. They were confident that they knew the right way to go. They were trying to follow the example of the Egyptian culture, which was all they knew, having been in captivity there for all that length of time. But he said that self-confidence in what the majority had done in Egypt led them astray. And they all died, all but those 2 men. But then Paul concludes, but take heart. It's not as hopeless as it might sound. God will not remove temptations from you. The things you're doing wrong, that your majority-based thinking has let you fall into, God's not going to remove the temptation to do that. But he is going to give you the opportunity to look at it the way you should look at it, and to improve your lot, and to improve your life in the ways that please him. He will provide defense. I'm sure you've heard it before. God will never allow you to face a temptation that you cannot defeat. And I think most of us have to remember those temptations that were like that and that did defeat us. But even those we can bring to the cross and understand that Christ died for our weakness and for our failure of action. Israel in the wilderness acted like Egypt. Corinthian Christians acted like Greek culture would lead them to act. The minorities were misled by the majority, by that thinking that, well, I want to be like them, I want to fit in there, even though I have now received the gift of God in Jesus Christ. Paul says, are you aware of how many rules you're violating, how many lines you've crossed by that majority thinking? The majority might be wrong. And I will submit to you, I think we live in exactly that kind of era today. The majority might be wrong. And it doesn't even matter what the majority says, since we have that owner's manual for life, God's 10 Commandments, and the underlying wonderful grace of God, forgiveness where we are too weak and shameful to continue as God would have us. We take that failure to the cross, and it too is covered by the blood of God's Son, who died that we might live and live forever. God guides, God protects, God forgives. Unfortunately, the majority often guides us in the wrong direction. But we need to remember who God is, what God has taught us, what we are blessed to know because God bothered to say it to us and nobody else did. The majority may be wrong. He is not. And we are his. Amen. That faith which guides us is explained and is shared with the world in the words of the Apostle